Evening, gang. How's everybody doing? How's everybody's day doing? I know today's midweek, Wednesday. They call it hump day, whatever in the world. But, it's just another awesome day that God's made. And no matter what takes place, I know that myself, I choose to rejoice and be glad in it. And I wanted to share with you, before I get into this, but as you note here in the beginning of my post, I wanted to spend some time today, and I did, listening to one of the most recent sermons from Pastor Chris of Bethel Church. And it's on a subject that I believe myself is not being taught properly. And that's about giving God our best, whether it's in our tithes, our time, or anything that God has given us a responsibility over. And what I'd like you to do is please check out the sermon, as well as the notes that I have here, that go along with it. After you do, please feel free to get back to me, and also, here on this, and give me your feedback on what you think of this sermon, and as well as what I'm about to say. And let's discuss on ways that we can give our best to God. Enjoy that. Okay, guys, now that you're done, what did you think of it? I know, pretty interesting, huh? Sounds a lot familiar, doesn't it? I wanted to add a few things to it. You see, like I said, I think that this is a subject that we're not discussing properly. I want to go into some things because I don't want to, go over, take long here. But part of what Pastor Chris was talking about in giving God our best includes, first and foremost, our tithes. Now, as a child, as a follower of Christ, as a Christian, one of the things that God commands is that we give a tenth of what we earn to Him. And I also believe, that doesn't necessarily have to include monetary, and I'll explain that in a little bit. In the Old Testament, this was something that God commanded the children of Israel to do, to give tithes and offerings. And Malachi chapter 3 verses 8 through 11 discusses something where God is confronting Israel in this area because they're not doing their job in this area. And I'm going to read this to you. He says, "Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings," is God's answer. God's basically stating, you guys have robbed me through not giving your tithes and offerings. And it isn't just about contributing to the temple, but this is giving back to God Himself. I think a lot of people don't realize that when we give, we're not simply giving to a church, we're giving back to God what He's given to us, especially in our tithes and what we earn. And here, Malachi is going on with that. And I want to go a little further. He says, "Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouses, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, and there shall not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground. Neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts." Now, what in the world is he talking about when it comes to this? I'll share it with you. Pardon me. Basically, from what I'm gathering, during the time of Malachi, there were some problems going on. Apparently they weren't, that there were moments where Israel wasn't following the Lord the way they should. And that happens with all of us. But one particular area that they weren't being very obedient on was the issue of tithing. And I want to share something with you on that. when it comes to that. Basically, what was going on, from what I remember, because they were holding back on this and not giving what they were supposed to, not just the temple and the priests were suffering, but God, in response to this lack of obedience, was causing them not to prosper. As he said in that last part, I'll rebuke the devourer for your sakes. And it's very interesting what he speaks of in this area. And he said, as I said, the whole issue of robbing God, and how he believed that God is stating, you're robbing me in this area. I want to read something out of the Asbury Bible Commentary. Maybe it can help you understand this. And he's talking about repentance in this area too. The people inquire how they're supposed to return, a question indicating that they're insensitive to the fact of their departure. They think we've done nothing wrong. Isn't that typical? Isn't that typical? It says they've actually robbed or cheated God of that which is due him, and the tithes and offerings have been withheld on a nationwide scale. And you notice here also in Nehemiah they're talking about this. And it says this is the cause of their poverty. The antidote for the curse upon them is to be faithful in the gifts required by the law. Their prosperity, if they're faithful in their obligations to God, will become known throughout the world, giving them a reputation of living in a delightful land. That's one aspect of it. I want to read another area here. I'm reading out of Joseph Benson's commentary, and I wanted to share that with you. He says here, when it comes to verses 8 and 9, will a man rob God? Grotius reads, would anyone dare to rob his judges if ye have robbed me? So this is what God is stating here. He says the word that basically here they were robbing God, and God's saying, you've robbed me. And how is it being done? It's through the fact that they're withholding their tithes. And he's saying the whole nation has done this, so they're all guilty of this. And this is talking about basically the fact that they've robbed God of their tithe. And it says in tithes and offerings, by this seems to be meant the first fruits of their ground and cattle and other offerings which were allotted to the priests, out of which revenue they were to provide the daily sacrifices and also to maintain the Levites who attended upon the service in the temple. So because they weren't doing this, God had punished them. They were under this heavy curse. And until they repented and started tithing, as he says here in Malachi chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, that you start making a punctual and full payment of these tithes, this curse was going to be on them. Now, I encourage you to, I'm going to post a link in this area, on both of these areas, and you can read these for yourself. But one of the things that I did learn in the course of this, that I wanted to share with you, over something God's shown me over the years, about the whole issue of tithing. There are a lot of people who take the issue of 10% and they take it, I believe they take it way too far. I don't know how to describe it, but I knew of pastors in particular that took it way too far, where they tried to take over people's finances and drain them of their money. And I'm also reminded, I've seen this happen. Please don't mind me, but I have seen this happen. I want to share something. I knew of a person who went to their pastor, and he was trying to see if he could afford a particular piece of property. And this pastor, it turned out later on, was not very reputable. And this pastor was beyond corrupt. And this pastor, the way he had it, when he was helping this person with their budget, this person saw that this supposed man of God was going to take away more than 10% of his hard-earned money. That even after he had taken care of tithing, the bills, and everything else, he would barely have anything left for himself and his family. And this person knew that this was wrong and walked away from it. As a matter of fact, this person and this person's family, they left that church because they discovered things going on within there. That's one example of bad teaching when it comes to tithing. When somebody says that, their version of 10% is more than 10%, you really have to start thinking. I encourage people to read the scriptures in this area. One of the things I learned from Pastor Hagee about this is that when it comes to tithing, you give the first fruits of what you have. Now, please don't mind me. I have these coupons here. I'm going to lay them out here. Okay? Imagine that they're money, okay? Imagine that they're money. Okay? What Pastor Hagee taught was you take the very first dollar or the very first dime of whatever you earn, and that's what you give to the Lord. You don't go paying off MasterCard, Visa, mortgage, and then God. That doesn't work. And this is something that Pastor Chris was kind of touching on a little bit. He says, who we give our most loyalty to is who we're saying we're the most thankful to. And for me, personally, from me personally as a follower of Christ, one of the first things I do, as many of you may or may not know, I get Social Security disability. And I make it a point, as soon as I get it, the first thing I do is I take 10% out of that monthly gift that the government has given me, and I consider it a gift, and I give that back to the Lord. That's the first thing I do when I get my Social Security in. And then secondly, I pay my bills. If I were to do it the other way around, I feel that that's not honoring God. I believe He wants the first fruits. He wants the first fruits of what we make. He wants the first fruits of our time. And one of the things that I read in the notes, in particular, that really spoke to me in this area, and I want to share with all of you, is that when we give back that 10%, He takes that 10% and He can multiply it. I mean, you look at what He talks about in the parable of the sower, how 30, 60, and 100-fold. I believe he does that. He will do that for us if we trust Him and obey Him. One of the things Pastor Chris was saying is how God knows our entire situation. He knows what we have. And He can take what little we have and bless us and multiply it beyond our imagination if we are willing to give Him the best of what we've got. And he was focusing on 1 Kings 17, verses 8 through 12, as well as, matter of fact, through 8 through 16, and then verses 17, 21, and 22. If you read the notes, you'll see what I'm talking about. But basically what he was saying is that God knows our entire situation. And He says who we choose, how He says this, when we invite God first, when we put God into that situation, We are, when we put God first, we are inviting God into that situation, whatever it might be. And that's what was going on here, especially when it came to Elijah and this widow. And he also says, like I said, what I give my first and best to demonstrates who I'm thankful to. And I want you to, when you listen, if you've heard this sermon, you'll see what I'm talking about. I mean, from my perspective, I find it very important to always, first thing when I'm blessed with this every month, to give that 10% to God first, and then I pay my bills. And that's what Ricky and I strive to do. I believe that, like this says, when I bring my first to God, it totally tips the scale. And I believe that when we give back to Him, He's completely honored. He is glorified and He blesses. But I want to share some other things with you too in this area. I encourage you to read these notes, and also listening to this sermon if you haven't. But I believe too, as he says here, God will do more with that 10% than we can do on our own with the other 90%. And I believe that there's a song that says, little is much when God is in it. And it is so true. I've seen that in my life, people. And I'm challenging you right now to be willing to give God your first and your very best. Because when you do that, whether it's not just tithes, but in your family life, in your marriage, your relationships with that special someone, your children, your job, your education, whatever it might be, when you give that to God and you allow Him to be first place in those things, He will produce so many blessings. As He says in Malachi, I will give you blessings that you can't contain. He promises that. And I want to encourage you to do something. Give God your very best in your tithe and in the things that you do, but in particular with tithing. Every time you get paid over the next 90 days, give 10% of it to your church. And just put a memo or somewhere that says 90-day challenge. And watch and see if God doesn't bless and provide because of your obedience. I'm giving you a triple dog dare on that. But I also encourage you to give God the best of yourself in your family, whether it's your husband, your wife, your children, other family members, your job, your education, whatever it might be. Give God the very best of you in it. And watch what He will do. Watch the blessings. I've got to get going, but I just urge you all in the Lord to be willing to give God your very best. Don't scrimp. I also want you to look up the parable of the talents and see what else I mean in this area about ways in which you can use your talents for God and give God your very best in that area. I have to get going, but I wish you all a really wonderful evening. And remember, don't be afraid to give God your all. Bye for now.